250 years ago, a radical idea began spreading across the world, that ordinary people, merchants, farmers, craftsmen, should have a say in how they were governed. Monarchs scoffed, aristocrats sneered, and yet, something remarkable happened. The nations that embraced this idea, messy, loud, contentious democracy, also became, over time, among the wealthiest in the history of human civilization. But was that a coincidence? Or does democracy, the very act of giving citizens a vote, somehow generate prosperity? Or is it the reverse? Does wealth come first, and then, once people are comfortable enough to think beyond survival, they demand democracy? This film tackles one of the most contested questions in political economy. We will follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when the answers are uncomfortable. Before we can answer whether democracy creates wealth, we need to agree on what democracy actually is. Most political scientists identify three essential ingredients. First, free and fair elections. The idea that citizens choose their leaders through regular competitive votes. Second, the rule of law. Not just laws on paper, but independent courts that enforce them equally, including against the powerful. And third, accountability. The ability of citizens to remove leaders who fail them, and a free press to expose those who lie. Notice what democracy is not in this definition. It is not simply majority rule. Ancient Athens had majority votes and used them to condemn Socrates to death and to enslave conquered peoples. True democracy, as economists and political scientists study it, is a package deal. Elections plus rights plus accountability. Remove any one leg of that stool and you have something else. This distinction matters enormously when we look at the data, because many regimes that call themselves democracies are not. The moment you conflate held an election with is a democracy, your analysis falls apart. We've seen dozens of countries hold elections and then ignore the results, or jail the opposition, or rig the count. Those aren't democracies in any meaningful economic sense. The question is not new. The Greeks themselves argued about it with remarkable sophistication. Athens, during its democratic peak in the 5th century BC, was also its wealthiest era. The city's port at Piraeus hummed with trade from across the Mediterranean. Silver mines at Laurion funded not just the navy, but the arts, architecture, and civic life. Was this wealth because of democracy, or merely alongside it? Aristotle saw a connection. He argued that dispersed political power created dispersed economic incentives. When ordinary citizens have political security, they work harder, invest more, and create more. But Plato disagreed bitterly. He saw democracy as mob rule, a system that elected demagogues and destroyed the discipline needed for long-term prosperity. Fast forward 2,000 years. Adam Smith, writing in 1776, the same year as the American Declaration of Independence, argued that economic freedom and political freedom were deeply intertwined. In The Wealth of Nations, he described how free markets where individuals could pursue their own interests, unhindered by royal monopolies and corrupt officials, generated unprecedented prosperity. But Smith was careful. He didn't say democracy itself created wealth. He said property rights, rule of law, and freedom from arbitrary seizure were the keys. Democracy was one vehicle for those things, but not the only one. That nuance, that it might be the institutions democracy tends to create, rather than voting itself, would become central to modern economic thinking. The 20th century became history's greatest unplanned experiment in comparative political economy. By 1900, the world had a handful of functioning democracies: Britain, France, the United States, a few others. The rest was empire, monarchy, and autocracy. Over the next 100 years, the world tried nearly every variation: fascist dictatorships, communist command economies, military juntas, theocracies, and liberal democracies. And the GDP data followed each system faithfully, telling us what worked. The natural experiments were sometimes heartbreaking in their clarity. When Korea was divided in 1953, North and South had virtually identical income levels, around $800 per person. Today, South Korea's GDP per capita exceeds $35,000. The North remains mired below $2,000, with periodic famines. The same pattern emerged in Germany. Same language, same culture, same industrial heritage. Divided for 45 years, one half democratic and free market, the other communist and authoritarian. By 1989, West German workers produced nearly 3 times what their East German counterparts did. But the 20th century also produced counterexamples that would complicate the story. Japan's explosive post-war growth happened under what some called a one-party democracy. South Korea's economic miracle in the 1960s and 70s was engineered under military dictatorship. Taiwan industrialized under authoritarian Kuomintang rule, and China, the world's most dramatic story of poverty reduction, did it all under a communist party that has never held a free election. These cases would fuel decades of debate, and they haven't stopped yet. What does the data actually say? Not anecdotes, not single countries, but the full sweep of evidence across time and nations. Economists Darren Acemoglu, Suresh Naidu, Pasquale Restrepo, and James Robinson, four of the most cited researchers in this field, published a landmark study in 2019 covering 175 countries across more than 50 years. Their finding democratization raises GDP per capita by approximately 20% over the following 25 years compared to countries that don't democratize. But the relationship is not a straight line. The gains are not immediate. In the first decade after a country democratizes, economic growth is sometimes lower because democratic transitions are messy. New governments must navigate competing interests, reform institutions, and manage the expectations of millions of newly empowered voters. The payoff comes later. 25 years out, the compounding effects of better institutions, less corruption, and more investment in education and health become visible in the data. Other major studies tell a similar story. Persson and Tabellini found that democracies tend to spend more on health and education investments that raise human capital and long-run productivity. Papaioannou and Siorounis found that democracy reduces income volatility. Authoritarian systems grow fast and then crash. Democracies grow more steadily. Perhaps most striking, a study of historical famines by economist Amartya Sen found that no substantial famine has ever occurred in a functioning multi-party democracy. Leaders who must face voters have very different incentives than those who do not. And yet the case against a simple democracy equals wealth equation is powerful. It demands serious engagement, not dismissal. Between 1980 and 2020, China lifted approximately 800 million people out of extreme poverty. Read that number again. 800 million. More than the entire population of Latin America, achieved under an unelected communist party that censors the press, jails political opponents, and maintains what Freedom House calls one of the world's most repressive regimes. Or consider Singapore. For over 50 years, the city-state has been governed by effectively a one-party state, the People's Action Party. Political opposition exists, but barely. The press is controlled. And yet Singapore boasts one of the world's highest GDP per capita figures, world-class infrastructure, and extraordinary levels of human development. Singapore is the case that every pro-democracy economist has to answer. It is a genuine outlier, or maybe it tells us something important about what democracy actually does versus what strong institutions do. The authoritarian growth story has a logic. A strong central government can make long-term investments without worrying about the next election cycle. It can resist short-term populist demands that crowd out saving and investment. It can break through vested interests and implement painful but necessary economic reforms. And it can do something democracies sometimes cannot. Commit credibly to a policy for 20 or 30 years without it being reversed by the opposition party that wins the next election. But here is what the authoritarian growth story almost always leaves out. For every China or Singapore, there are a dozen Venezuelas, Zimbabwe's, and Congo's autocracies that impoverish their people. For every Lee Kuan Yew building Singapore into a marvel, there are a dozen Mobutu Sese Sekos looting their nations dry. Authoritarian growth, when it works brilliantly. When it fails, and it often fails, there is no mechanism to stop the disaster. It is worth being honest about the genuine structural weaknesses of democratic systems when it comes to economic performance. First, the election cycle problem. A democratic politician's career is measured in 4 to 5 year terms. The incentive is to produce visible short-term wins. Tax cuts, spending boosts, quick infrastructure projects, even when long-term fiscal discipline would be better. Second, interest group capture. Democratic systems are vulnerable to well-organized minorities who use their political power to protect inefficient industries, block necessary reforms, or extract subsidies at the public's expense. This was the insight of economist Mancur Olson, who argued in The Rise and Decline of Nations that the longer a stable democracy exists, the more it accumulates these special interest barnacles until growth slows to a crawl. Third, the distributional pressure. Democratic electorates have every incentive to vote for redistribution, taxing the wealthy, expanding welfare, raising the minimum wage. Some redistribution is healthy. Too much can reduce the incentive to invest and innovate. And fourth, the gridlock problem. When democracy works well, it requires consensus. When consensus is hard to build, the result is legislative paralysis, infrastructure not built, reforms not passed, problems left to fester. These are not made-up concerns invented by autocrat apologists. They are genuine structural features of democratic systems documented in hundreds of peer-reviewed studies. The question is not whether they exist, they do. The question is whether the long-run advantages of democracy outweigh them.